Last month, I beat 10 games in an attempt to reduce my incredibly large backlog, and here are my thoughts on each one of them. The games range from roguelites to open world survival games to RPGs to JRPGs to puzzle games to platformers. Any genre you can think of, I'll probably have it. I just really like buying good games. Anyways, my explanation for my metrics are in the description just in case you're curious why I rate a game a value lower than your own. Let's start the video. Cyber Shadow is a 2D platformer inspired by the classic Ninja Gaiden series. And much like Ninja Gaiden, this game is excruciatingly difficult. Originally I was interested in this game because it reminded me of a mixture of Messenger as well as Shovel Knight, with Messenger being one of my favorite platformers. While I personally don't think it's a better game than either of those mentioned, it's definitely a solid platformer on its own. This game does its job as a 2D platformer, but much like a Metroidvania, it gets drastically more fun to later stages when you've unlocked all your abilities, and the stages make full use of everything you learned. The story is nothing special, but it does its job to give the player character an end goal. It's not that generic, as there is a bit of lore lying around to add depth to the story, but it's not the reason you play the game for. However, that being said, it was by far the most frustrating game I've played this month. While it was very difficult, that was not the source of my frustrations. Let's talk about the atrocious controls and inputs. Your key presses are not registered simultaneously, so if you input two separate commands, one will usually overwrite the other. Many other games will usually adjust for this, making it so that you can cancel inputs with another command. I also hated how the controls for your abilities are tied to the same key as your movement keys. For example, my biggest gripe with an input is that pairing require you to double tap one of your movement keys. But double tapping a movement key while moving is also how you sprint. And because controls aren't registered simultaneously, I often got screwed over by this. Despite the game's difficulty, by far what made this game so frustrating for me was its controls, especially because it's a platformer and controls are very important. Despite my gripes with its controls though, I still think the game deserves a recommendation for its content and gameplay. A score of 70 seems fair and serves as a good starting point for the video. Originally I had very high expectations for Blade Assault. I played a bit of this game during early access and saw the potential this roguelite had. The movement felt fast and fluid, the controls were very precise, and the overall combat stimulated my dopamine levels to the max. I thoroughly enjoyed whipping enemies with KD Akali and spamming dodges to avoid getting one shot, because originally, the game was very punishing. But with its precise movement inputs and very high damage potential that you could possess with your build, your best defense was offense. However, that was until I played the 1.0 launch of Blade Assault. With the 1.0 release, it seems that the game's base difficulty has taken a different direction. Enemies are far fewer now, but they seem to have received 10 times more health, with innate damage reduction, making the game feel more like Risk of Rain or Enter the Gungeon, where fights take a lot longer. Those games are by no means bad roguelites, however their style does not match at all with this type of game, especially when the combat feels stretched out and tedious, as opposed to intended like Gungeon. And because the difficulty increases over time like Risk of Rain, the tankiness of these enemies make this increase in difficulty feel artificial as opposed to a lack of skill. At least most enemies don't tend to one-shot you like in the past, except that's not even a positive because I was stuck spam clicking left click for 20 minutes and being diagnosed with carpal tunnel syndrome. My original verdict for this game prior to playing the full release and simply judging based on my early access experience was that this game was going to be at minimum a 75. However, my experience from playing it extensively on the launch day was definitely a 50. And I assumed it was going to stay that way for a while, until the developers came out with a patch less than 2 days later, fixing some game-breaking bugs and some much-needed balance changes. While they didn't address everything, and even now some enemies still feel like damage sponges depending on your build, the fact that I had such a quick response and actually tackled many of the right issues gives me hope for the future of this game. Funnily enough, the health issue isn't a big problem anymore at higher difficulties, because while enemies hit a lot harder, you also get access to more items due to an increase in currency, so you end up dealing far more damage than normal. As for some other issues, Blade Assault has a severe lack of enemy variety and item variety, in a sense that most passives you pick up are simply increase in stats. Certain builds and characters are also far superior than others, which is a given in any game, as no build is ever going to be equal. However, the level of difference here isn't even comparable. So even if you have a preference for a certain playstyle or build, you'll definitely struggle far more than if you pick something else. However, this game has a good baseline. The combat is fun and there's a lot of variety in how you build around your choice of weapons. Around this time, the developers have promised to still update the game, so expect even more content in the future. Right now, my score for this game will be a 73, and that's under a belief that they will fix the remaining issues in the future. I will say with its current circumstances, I can't give a solid recommendation, but I have to emphasize that I do think the game has a lot of potential just with its combat alone. If there was one word to describe Streets of Rogue, it would be
guacamole, chicken, bacon, centipede, brain damage, sit.
Streets of Rogue is technically a roguelike game, but it feels more like an RPG above all else. You can pretty much play the game however you want, as long as the way you want to play is as chaotic and absurd as possible. Streets of Rogue is chaos incarnate in a video game. Your job in Streets of Rogue is to assassinate a corrupt mayor in any way possible. When I say assassinate, I don't mean it in the traditional sense. You're probably thinking stealth, snipers, very precise timing, and you'd be kinda close. I turned into a giant in the middle of town and crushed a mayor's skull with my gigantic fists, took his hat, and became elected as a new mayor because the hat possesses all the power. And that's only 1 out of 100 million ways to play the game. Want to progress through the game guns blazing? Go ahead. Want to stealth your way through the game? Go ahead. Want to beat the game as a pacifist? Probably possible, except you never see me doing that. Heck, want to play as the incarnation of Harambe invoking his wrath on the citizens of this stupid world? Go ahead. There's no words for me to describe this game, you have to experience it yourself. Much like the gameplay loop, my perceived score of this game is chaotic. For the average roguelite and RPG fan, this game will probably hover around 50 to 100, depending on your preference. So I will give the game a 75, which I think is fair for the game. While I did think it was very enjoyable, as a roguelite it would not be my first choice to play, especially for its combat. It serves its purpose, but it's far from the main strength of the game. Grim Dawn's a top-down hack-and-slash action RPG set in an apocalyptic dark fantasy world. I have no idea why I randomly decided to start playing Grim Dawn out of the blue, but it definitely hooked me in with its responsive and addicting gameplay loop of killing enemies, looting your bodies, killing stronger enemies, and looting their bodies. I spent hours at a time running around the entire map killing hordes of the undead, just so I can get a chance of obtaining higher rarity gear, only to end up selling all the gear to obtain currency that I never used to this day. Gameplay isn't all that Grim Dawn has to offer though. The story is what motivates your character to go to certain areas and kill certain enemies and bosses. And even outside the main story, there are side quests and optional enemies to add more to the world building, and more understanding the different factions and inhabitants of this world. However, the main narrative isn't anything too special, because your actual motivation for this game is to go full monkey mode and slaughter every single beast and loot every single item on the floor. And once you beat the main story, you gain access to harder difficulties, which requires you to replay the entire campaign, facing off stronger enemies but also obtaining far greater loot. If you're already a fan of Path of Exile and Diablo, then you will love Grim Dawn, especially with the dual class system, which allows you to go for very creative builds by speccing into different paths of 2 different classes to create unique synergies each run. Overall, I give Grim Dawn a 76, and that's only because after my first playthrough I was completely burnt out of the game, so I never fully committed to the gameplay loop. But it's good enough to recommend, and for anyone that's a fan of this genre, it should easily be over an 80 for you. Dead Estate is a top-down bullet hell roguelite, with extreme similarities to both Enter the Gungeon and Binding of Isaac. So much so that I would have thought it was collaborative effort from the developers of both games to make Dead Estate. What separates this game from the other two is its art style, theme, and big mommy milkers. The game starts out with 2 characters, but you unlock a lot more as you progress through the game, each with your own unique playstyles and perks. The gameplay is what you would expect from an isometric shooter. There's a lot of weapon variety with different guns having differing effects, and generally are fun to use or have an impact to it. And the difficulty feels almost perfect. I feel like each run, no matter what, is always winnable with enough skill, regardless how terrible your build is. A strong build will obviously have a higher chance to win, and you'll have an easier time, but the reverse isn't really true. You can easily win with a weaker build without the need to play perfectly. And even if you feel like your build is so terrible that you can't beat the game given your skill level, you gain access to the option to loop at the final resting floor, like an R key from Isaac. This still counts as a full run, you'll just gain more access to more items, if you're willing to invest more time on a singular run. And there's no shortage of content either, as there are bonus stages that you can unlock later on, which gives you access to more gameplay per run. My big issue with Dead Estate, however, is the item variety. Most items don't feel like they're game-changing in the sense that they don't change the fundamental way you play your character, nor do they affect playstyles in any way. Most tend to be stat changes or power-ups, but nothing too unique. And that's probably the biggest separator from Binding of Isaac and Gungeon. In Isaac, for example, if you were to play the exact same character in 5 different runs, each one of those runs will most likely result in completely different builds that alter how you interact with the enemies and how you play the game. In Dead Estate, you don't really get that, which is why I think I'll give the game a 79. Since the character variety, weapon variety, and gameplay itself are still worth playing the game for. It's so close to greatness and has the content necessary to be a great roguelite to play as a main game, but more unique items could take it to the very top.
Magic.
I hate this game so much. I don't think I've ever died as many times in a single session that I have with Noita, but I love it. I don't think I've ever had so much fun dying as much as I have in Noita. That being said, I do hate playing the game, but I respect it so much. Noita is a roguelike game unlike any other. It is a game built on synergy and exploration. In Noita, you have the ability to combine different spells that you find throughout its massive world into one wand, which can have amazing to catastrophic results. These results range from strong projectiles which can lock onto enemies and kill them, obviously, to a giant nuke that destroys the entire world including you, several times. Luckily you won't get to experience your game crashing several times because your run would be over already. I'm not kidding, by the way, there are millions of ways to kill yourself in this game. It will be the perfect game for an edgy teenager trying to live their fantasy. But let's not forget the exploration aspect of the game. The biomes that you explore at each stage in Noita are far larger than you might expect on your first few playthroughs, and that's because the large majority of these areas aren't accessible by normal means. Typically you'll need some type of destruction spell or immunity to gain access to certain areas, which may contain special enemies, items, or literally nothing. I don't know, because I'm not even aware of 90% of the secrets hidden in this game, and neither is the fandom, because the large majority of Noita is probably still unexplored, due to the developers not giving any hints or any markers to indicate them. And that's not necessarily a negative feature of the game, I just literally can't tell you, because I don't know if they exist. You might end up discovering something no one else has in your own playthrough, and I think that's a huge positive for the game. If this sounds interesting to you already, my only warning is that when starting out, you should never play this game expecting to win a single run. Aside from several dangerous enemies and areas, there are so many different ways you'll end up dying because you thought a spell looked cool in a wand, and only for that theory to be true. Just, you forgot to count the fact that it would kill you as well. And if you want to play conservatively and only mix and match spells that look safe, please don't do that, because genuinely, part of the fun of the game is embracing death and seeing how many combinations can kill you. I give the game an 80 because despite my absolute hatred for playing the game, I love the innovation, the actual design of the game, and I speculate that those who are already interested in what the game sounds like would easily find it to be above a 90. This section will feature 2 games as I feel like they accomplish similar goals just with different settings. And those games are Subnautica and The Forest. Both are open world survival games with a narrative and end goal for the player, which isn't really something common with many survival games. Usually the intent for this genre is for infinite replayability, but without a set goal for the player. And that's not to say that both these games don't have infinite replayability, but a game does intend for you to conclude its world one day. Let's start with The Forest. Your objective in The Forest is to not only escape your current predicament, but escape alongside your child, who is kidnapped by a naked man after your plane crashed unexpectedly. Your job is to venture into caves to find clues to your son's whereabouts, while trying to survive in a forest filled with cannibals and mutants. The Forest has a huge emphasis on cave exploration and learning about its mysterious world, but the overworld section is where it's lacking. Relative to open world games in general, The Forest is quite small in comparison, and there's not much to do outside of the caves. However, it's compensated by its focus on world building and lore, as well as the enemy AI. Oftentimes I felt like the AI was incredibly unpredictable, not in the sense that it was completely random, but it felt like the AI was trying to observe the player's actions and adapt to it. And while the inventory mechanic does have its flaws, I really like how your inventory isn't determined by total weight, but categories, where you can only carry a set amount of specific items belonging to a specific category at once. This made inventory management less of a pain compared to other survival games, but also made it so at times you have to continuously backtrack to gather specific resources in the early game. Subnautica is obviously different from The Forest, where rather than a forest, you're stranded in the ocean filled with alien lifeforms that you have to identify through exploration. Many are passive and can act as resources, while others are dangerous predators that you have to avoid. Subnautica's world, compared to The Forest, is huge, and requires constant backtracking due to your lack of inventory space as well as oxygen meter. It is your goal to find a way to escape, so your task is to explore as much of the world as possible to find any clues that you might need. And while The Forest might be creepy at times with its atmosphere, Subnautica takes it to a whole nother level with its sound design and setting, There's just something about the ocean and the fear of the unknown that makes the game so immersive. And while I thought the forest world served its purpose, it eventually became repetitive to walk around, unless it was exploring a brand new cave. I mostly never felt that way with Subnautica. Each biome is so drastically different from one another with its own ecosystem and challenges. It felt rewarding exploring a certain area because of an assigned mission, only to discover a completely new territory or encounter a new creature that may or may not jump scare you. While Subnautica's world is definitely the main strength, its progression system is something worth praising the game for, because it's what makes exploring so rewarding in the first place. At no point do I feel like the game was progressing at an abnormal pace. Each stage of progression essentially allows you to explore more areas and learn more about this world, and the areas that can't be accessed at your current stage usually are in the way of your current progress, so you never feel like the game is taunting you into thinking, "Oh, you shouldn't be here right now." And once you do progress through a certain stage and gain access to more areas, they feel natural. The game doesn't hold your hand, and you're responsible for all the progress and discoveries that you've made. Any markers the game gives you acts as a reference point to what you can potentially discover, not as a way to command you and tell you what to do. And that's what makes exploring so worth it. It's part of how you directly progress, it gives you a reason to explore, and it's what makes the game so interesting and immersive. It's all tied to your own ability to go out and explore the world. I would say that while the forest focused more on the lore aspect, Subnautica had more emphasis on exploration and world building, alongside its fairly deep story. Even though the forest is good enough to be an 80, Subnautica took it a step further, enough to gain 5 points over it. But that's not to say you should pick Subnautica over Forest. They're both good enough to be played, especially with other friends. I just have a preference for Subnautica. It's important for me to mention that while co-op is fun, it can definitely make the games lose some of its charm by removing part of the atmosphere and mood, so keep that in mind. Open world survival games also tend to be a genre that I'm not particularly a fan of, so the fact I rated these games so high should give you more confidence, especially if you're an enthusiast of the genre, to consider playing these games. Personally, Sons of the Forest is one of my most anticipated games of the year, so I can't wait for that. Return of the Obra Dinn was not a game I was expecting to play this month, but once my friend asked me if I wanted to play alongside him and offered to purchase the game, I was completely on board. And while this may not count directly towards my backlog, I have had this game on my wishlist for the longest time and would have intended to buy it eventually, so I'm counting it. Return of the Obra Dinn was a pleasant surprise for me this month because while I was aware that this game was considered phenomenal, it didn't change the fact that I tend to despise not only puzzle games, but detective mystery games. And while Return of the Obra Dinn has not changed my preference for the genre, it was still an amazing experience despite my gripes with the genre. Return of the Obra Dinn is not a detective game like any other. It does not give you any direct hints or point you towards a specific direction. It is up to you to determine the fates of all 60 passengers on the Obra Dinn by examining a short memory of a deceased passenger and see for yourself how that particular individual, or individuals in some cases, either died or mysteriously disappeared. This is a game built on inference and deduction. You will often have to make an educated guess on an individual's fate, as many of the scenarios don't clearly show you what happened to them. And this makes the game very difficult, especially for someone like me who likes to go full monkey brain whenever I boot up a game. Even while struggling heavily during the game, at nearly no points did either I or my friend think to look up clues and spoil ourselves of the experience. The very few times that did happen was either an accident, or because we were stuck despite the hints being right under our noses, and we missed it due to negligence. This game's writing is one of the best I've ever seen from any medium, and I've never felt so rewarded after successfully solving a mystery. And at no point does the game drop in quality in terms of story writing, as each plot point connects so well that there is no confusion in the end, especially since the game is told in reverse chronological order, so while confusing at the start, everything starts to make sense as you progress through the game. The art style is also incredibly charming and unique, although at times it can mess up your perception of a clue due to it seeming unclear. But that only happened around 2 times for me throughout the 12 hours of gameplay, and its strengths definitely overshadowed a small gripe of mine. Return of the Obra Dinn is definitely a minimum of an 85 in my book. And that's not because it is lacking in many areas, but it is an 85 despite my distaste for the genre, and a pretty bad experience with some of the actual video game mechanics. A small gripe I have for the game was a lack of ability to instantly select a specific memory through a menu option. And because of this, we had to backtrack to the corpse's location each time without even the option to sprint. People who have completed this game already know what I'm talking about, unless me and my friend were just too dumb to figure out that it actually exists in the game, but I doubt it. Despite this, if you are impartial to detective mystery games, or even loved them, this is easily one of the best games you can pick up, period. It does lean towards the niche side of gaming though. Much like most of the games on this list, I decided to play Everhood after randomly scrolling through my list of games from my library to decide what to play. And it was definitely a good one, as Everhood has one of the most unique combat systems I've seen in a video game, coupled with an amazing soundtrack and fairly deep story. Originally, I was under the impression that 2021, relative to other recent years, was a pretty bad year for gaming. However, with games like Everhood and plans to play Death's Door and Inscription, my perception may in fact change soon. It's always the indie games that end up delivering on good games. Anyways, Everhood is a rhythm-based bullet hell RPG set in a mysterious world known as, you guessed it, Everhood. And if I were to describe this game in one sentence, it would be
a love child of Undertale and Guitar Hero made on Woodstock while both being on acid.
Thanks KB for letting me borrow the comment, even if I didn't ask for permission. While both rhythm and bullet hell aren't for everyone, this game does a good job at making it accessible for anyone that's struggling. And in my opinion, its unique style makes it enjoyable enough that anyone can have fun playing it. Each fight sequence also feels unique and challenging, so the game never becomes repetitive. It only gets better from start to finish. But even with its gameplay strengths, it has the type of story that's short but meaningful, good enough to make you reflect on its topic for a while. And on top of it all, its biggest strength is its music, as the game itself even embraces its own soundtrack by building its gameplay around it. Each soundtrack fit its theme and adds to the excitement and mood of the game, and is what suppressed my urge to punch my monitor whenever I struggled with a fight, as the music was good enough for me to vibe through the frustration of the challenge. Because the game is definitely very hard for the average player. Unless you're a Toho player or you play it on an easier difficulty, you will find yourself struggling in a few fights. It definitely was worth it though, which is why I'm giving the game a 90, the highest of this series so far. If you want a more in-depth video, check out my official Everhood review. So that was all the games I beat this month, ranked in order. If you enjoyed the start of the series, consider leaving a like and subscribing. I hate adding this to my script every time, but it's part of the YouTube system and it works. If you're interested in my content, I make other videos reviewing games, usually those that tend to be more niche and more underrated, so you can watch any past ones or subscribe for newer ones. February will also have some banger games, so look out for those as well. I'll try to make reviews for each game shorter for this series, as the plan is to cover the games and briefly summarize my thoughts for them, as opposed to analyzing each one. I'll probably make dedicated reviews for any games I rate above a 90, although I still plan on reviewing some games I rated below that score. By the way, remember to read the description if you want to understand my metrics, and feel free to leave a comment recommending me more games to play in the future. I'd love that.